It's Emil Guillermo. Emil Amok to you. This is Emil Amok's Takeout, all things considerable. Really? I mean, this is what I call the micro talk show. The AAPI and the AAXs, Asian American Pacific Islander. Hey, the Tongans, they're in the forefront. Last couple of days, we've been talking about the Tongans. Fortunately, it hasn't been as serious, but man, what a shake down there. AAXs, Asian American, fill in your ethnicity. And if you're none of those, either of those, or neither of those, then you're just an ALL, all the rest of us. How are you? It's good to be here. This is show 227. I've done 227 of these because everyone needs to know, what does an Asian American think? WDAAAT? What that? And that's why we do this. And there's a number of things that we must talk about. And you can check our previous shows, 226, 225, 224, et cetera, et cetera. This week has been a very interesting one because we knew what was going to happen, right? We knew that the Senate was going to not pass voting rights. So we kind of anticipated that, okay, we could potentially win by losing because we can go out to people and say, hey, look what's going on. Look who is anti-democracy. Look who voted to take away your right to vote. I mean, that's the way you should look at this. The voting legislation that was stymied because two Democrats wouldn't go with the other Democrats to cut a Republican filibuster or to stop a Republican filibuster. It essentially killed the Freedom to Vote Act and also the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Two federal measures that would have counteracted what's going on in the states to take away people's rights to vote. Like when you want to vote, where you vote, how you vote, by mail, by drop box. All these limitations being placed, 19 states. And the federal legislation was going to change that, including changing gerrymandering and changing ways that, people of color, Asian Americans, have been cut out of our democracy. And this is our democracy. Don't forget that. I mean, that's a big part of this, that this has always been the way that we've been excluded. And it hasn't changed. 2022, we are still being excluded. That's the way you should look at last night's vote in the Senate. It got some play. Some people say, oh, well, it happened. Yeah. Well, let's not forget. We cannot forget. It is a big deal, a bigger deal, but the question is, can we use it to let people know how our democracy is changing, how our democracy is threatened? And that's going to be not just on the Democrats, and it's on everyone. It's on us to let people know who don't vote. Because, there are people who don't vote. Let them know how important this is. All right, so I just want to get off on that first because that is sort of the major thing that affects Asian Americans, people of color, the Voting Rights Act. ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, they've been working on trying to turn around the parts that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act would have restored, which is federal oversight on any laws that would have an impact on people of color, communities of color. So that's issue one. Let me go into the other issue that is really the news of the day. This is the anniversary of really I think one of the highlights for Asian Americans who follow politics when you see an African American, Asian American woman, Kamala Harris, be inaugurated as Vice President of the United States. And it was 1 year ago today. And this is 1 year, right? 1 year after all the Biden Harris ticket gets to Washington. And so everyone's talking about that, about 1 year after. It's still a big deal. It's still a big deal. I mean, no matter what you want to say, no matter if you agree with them or don't, because we know that there's dissension among Asian Americans even. There are people who are on the other side still. But it is a big deal that Kamala Harris is there. And if you go to my ALDEF blog, my ALDEF column, Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, I talk about this. Joe Biden's presidency, a year old today. And here's the thing. All I can think about is Michelle Go. Now you're saying, Michelle, if you've been listening to me and my previous shows, you know who Michelle Go is. If you live in New York City, you know who Michelle Go is. They had her picture up in lights in Times Square. An artistic rendering of her in her honor the other day when they held that vigil in New York City. At the same time, they had a vigil in Portsmouth Square in San Francisco's Chinatown, because Michelle Go is from the Bay Area. Grew up, graduated from American High in Fremont. I just kept thinking about Michelle Go. Every time I thought about Biden's press conference yesterday, what he said, as I thought about it through the night, as we got to the actual anniversary day of the Biden administration, I just kept thinking about Michelle Go, because I just figured if Biden had only during that news conference let us know that he knew how we feel. That's the thing that was missing, I think. I mean, Biden had a lot of long answers, longest press conference, right? About 2 hours. They said it was historic just because of length, which is good and bad, because Biden, the best answer to really what I thought was the newsy question, after a year on the job, he said pretty much he wants to run again. He likes his job. He's not just going to stay another 3 years. He wants to run again. And the question came from Kristen Welker of NBC News. She asked, you put Vice President Harris in charge of voting rights. Are you satisfied with her work on the issue? And Welker wasn't just satisfied with getting an answer on voting rights. She wanted the HR status of the first African American, Asian American woman to hold the second highest office in the land. Kristen Welker wanted news. So she asked, can you guarantee, do you commit that she will be your running mate in 2024? And then she slipped in this little, I don't know if it was a dig or just a little loosening of the news. She said, provided that you run again. Now, did Biden, as maybe is customary, did he hem and haw? No. He was as direct as it gets. He didn't hesitate. Yes and yes. And then Welker seemed to be kind of stunned by the brevity, asked, care to expand? And Biden said, no need to. She could be my running mate, number one. And number two, I did put her in charge. I think she's doing a good job. And once again, that is despite the fact that yesterday voting rights did not pass. He still thinks she did a good job. And she did. She did about as much as she could. But as I said, the big news from the press conference, even though there were other things that people are picking at today, like Ukraine, slight incursion or invasion, is it giving a green light to Putin? We should care about Ukraine. It probably would have been better if Biden put it in terms of we're defending all democracies. We defend the free world. And we will, in no uncertain terms, defend the democracy of Ukraine. He didn't really say, although he said, I guess he was still being folksy. I guess he didn't see himself quite on the world stage when he was talking with reporters. But anyway, that's sort of the big news out of that press conference. But I thought the big news is that he wants to run again. And he says he wants to get out of the White House to meet people and see people face to face, which sounded to me like a campaign. And I think this could be a way of jumpstarting his campaign or jumpstarting his presidency. Because if he wants the American public, all he really needed to do was to let us know he gets it. He knows how hard it is to be an American these days. He knows what we're going through. He knows what the price of tofu and kimchi is at the supermarkets. And he should have let us know that he understands Michelle Go. Now, I mention this because Asian Americans from coast to coast, like I said, she's from the Bay Area. She went to New York. She's in people's minds. If you don't know Michelle Go, she was essentially an Asian American success story, right? She Bay Area to UCLA to an MBA in New York City. She joined a major firm. Her life was ahead of her. And then last Saturday morning, she's at Times Square waiting on the platform. And, it's morning. Feature's bright. She's going somewhere. Suddenly, she's pushed from behind. Yeah, I Go never saw what hit her. She's out of balance. She found herself on the tracks. And the train comes up and kills her. Now, it could be one of the more than 10,000 Asian American hate crimes in the nation since the pandemic began. Still being investigated, but it looks more like the perp who was a homeless man off his meds. That is a theme. Homeless man off his meds may have attacked at least one other person that day and maybe wasn't targeting Asians. And as I look through some of the archive, this is not the first time anyone's been pushed off a subway. There was a subway push in 2012. Sunando Sen pushed from behind, once again in New York, and died. The perp was a woman off her meds. And she was charged with second-degree murder. It was a hate crime. And she told investigators at the time that Sunando Sen, she thought was Hindu or Muslim, and she shoved him in retaliation for 9/11. Now that was a hate crime. What happened to Go, maybe what I call a hate coincidence, still horrifyingly tragic, still hurtful, and still a problem. But how do you prevent such a crime? A better question maybe, how do you protect innocent victims like Go? More policing in the subways? See, this isn't an isolated situation. And since at least 1999, people have been pushed off platforms in the subway. And you'll recall in 1999, that's when Kendra Webdale was pushed and killed. And in New York, they passed a law in her name to make sure that dangerous people off their meds were committed to treatment before they became violent. They called it Kendra's Law. It's not perfect. And depending upon, you can see all the critiques of it on the web. It depends on what studies are done and who's doing the studies. But it doesn't really address homelessness, violence, doesn't really address the mental health system well enough. It may help prevent some perps, but it doesn't quite help to prevent victims like Michelle Go. I mean, these are really big problems in our society, and we don't really know how to get out of them. I mean, it's up to the state and local officials to figure it out, I guess, to regulate and solve. But it's a big ask. Do you throw more money at what? It's not easy to figure out what's the next thing to do. But we keep fighting for an answer. And meanwhile, Michelle's friends, her family in California, they're hoping they're hoping she's remembered for her joyousness in life and not for how she died. But I think maybe Michelle Go's purpose is that her memory best serves us as a metaphor. How we're all hurting in this country right now and looking for a sense of normal. We've all been knocked from behind by a number of things, COVID, by the economy. We've lost our sense of balance. I mean, even the president seemed at the press conference to have lost his sense of balance about what's normal and how things work, thinking that Republicans would help him come across the aisle and get things done. Oh, they did with the bridges and the roads infrastructure plan, which is not insignificant. But they didn't help him with Build Back Better. They didn't help him with voting rights. So here we are. We've been pushed from behind. COVID and the economy. And there we are. We're all there. Train isn't coming. So there's still time to look to each other to help us all get back up. And I think we just need to know that this is where we are. We're trying to get back up together. So here's the thing. After 1 year of Biden, his approval ratings are around the mid to low 40 range. Still higher than the previous administration. And that's saying a lot. He's still not Donald Trump. And that's the good thing. In November 2020, that was the best thing going for Biden. And since then, like you said, he's done some good things, but he hasn't had the cooperation. I mean, what he's been able to do is pretty significant. The infrastructure bill is not insignificant. The Trump administration couldn't do that. Reassembling a broken government that Trump took apart and didn't even fully staff, well, that's significant. And now, instead of a Trump administration that fueled the denial of COVID and science, at least now we have a country that's catching up, getting closer to where we need to be for vaccinations and boosters. We've got tests and masks being distributed for free now. And in general, though, the feeling is things aren't perfect. But you have to admit, 1 year of Biden is still better than a fifth year of Trump. It takes time to recover. We've been knocked from behind and we're seeking balance. So when I saw Joe Biden at that press conference, I just kept thinking, well, he's trying. It's a bright spot. He's not Donald Trump, the man who knocked the United States off balance. But we're still struggling to find our way up and forward. And as he said at the press conference, it sounds like he wants to run again. I mean, he didn't deny it. He said Kamala Harris can be his vice president. So I think going forward, what he needs to do is he needs to let Americans know that he understands we've been pushed from behind. We've been knocked down. And now he should lead. If he can. That's a big if. He needs help from the other side. So the 1 year anniversary, still other things in the news I think are worth talking about. Teddy Roosevelt. Did you see this? The statue of Teddy Roosevelt, the 26th president of the United States, was removed last night from the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. If you haven't seen it, I walked by it once when I was up there. It's a bronze statue. It shows Teddy Roosevelt on a horse, and there's an African American and a Native American standing next to the horse. And it's been part of a big debate for years. And finally, they took the statue down. And, you know, we've been taking down statues left and right? Robert E. Lee comes down. Good. There are other statues I want to take down. But I suppose, like the hiker. I've talked about the hiker on my column on the ALDEF website. But in 2020, former Mayor de Blasio said it's the right decision to take this down and remove it. They took it down. De Blasio said it depicts Black and Indigenous people as subjugated and racially inferior. Of course, Donald Trump called it ridiculous at the time. And he urged, the New York City not to remove it. They did. So it's down. It's going to go to the Roosevelt Presidential Library, which is going to be open in the Badlands in North Dakota sometime in 2026, which is probably a better home for it than in public display at the museum in New York. And as I'm thinking about it, just think about Roosevelt's history. Think about how he was president during the colonization of the Philippines, 1901 to 1909. He was the first president to apparently invite an African American, Booker T. Washington, to dine at the White House. And even though Roosevelt pushed for what they call a square deal for all races and classes, generally speaking, right? That's what you remember Teddy Roosevelt from your history books in high school for cracking down on the monopolies, right? But you thought of him as being more fair. One thing they left out in the history books is that Roosevelt believed in white supremacy. Maybe not like some Southerners, but there was a streak. He believed in, if not the supremacy, then at least the superiority. Am I just quibbling there? Superiority of white culture. And here's one thing I didn't know. Teddy Roosevelt supported the eugenics movement. So I guess it's good. When I went to Teddy Roosevelt's alma mater, maybe I was there as a kind of anti-Roosevelt penance. But it's actually good news that they took that statue of Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, 26th president of the U.S. They took it down at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. I know that a lot of Filipinos that I know who live in New York, they've sent me notes saying, hey, so walk by this all the time. When it was a big debate during Trump's time, I got a bunch of notes from people. This is the first. This is the first of a couple of statues that have to come down that involve Asian American history. That hiker, which is in Arlington, and replicas of it are in cities around the country. That's another one that needs to come down. The hiker. Anyway, goodbye, Teddy. One more bit in the news to consider. This thing has happened just within the last couple hours in Florida. A bill has been passed out of committee, and they're calling it the Individual Freedom Act. Or right now, it's the Individual Freedom Bill. And here's what it does. In Florida, this is just a state law, but you know, things have a, you know, they replicate, just like bad voting laws, right? And bad laws about affirmative action and race. They just replicate. So here's this Florida Individual Freedom Bill. It bans public schools, private businesses from making people feel discomfort or guilt based on race, sex, and nationality. We don't want to make you feel bad. You have individual freedom to not feel bad. This is kind of like a millennials bill or something, not the individual freedom bill. Is Florida going to give everyone a trophy too for participation? Here's another aspect. Teachers must address discriminatory topics in age-appropriate manner. Now, what does that mean? That means no one's at fault here. We all love each other, except when we don't. This is not to encourage or to deny racism or to decry racism. You have your individual freedom to feel what you want about all the bad things, but you should not feel discomfort or guilt based on race, sex, or nationality. Imagine that. And here's a third point. Prohibits employer training that promotes belief that anyone is responsible for acts committed in the past. No one is responsible. They have just given everyone in history uh, a pass. They have absolved whites from feeling bad about anything they might have done to the indigenous, to the blacks, to people of color. It prohibits employee training, employer training that promotes belief that anyone is responsible for acts committed in the past. I guess that means they'll have to get rid of, well, that's employer training. And I guess it's Florida, so they're against history. They're against history. Anyway, this bill is like the it's like an aspirin for racists. Take this and you'll feel better in the morning. It's like it never happened. You don't have to feel bad. It's the abortion of history, the individual freedom bill. Let's hope it dies a violent death in Florida and never gets out. But somehow I think it's going to, people are going to find it and they're going to start replicating. It's going to be like the Johnny Appleseed of the individual freedom bill. And it's going to be in all the red states. And we're going to have to reckon with this nationally. Emil Amok warned you first. So, someone asked on the chat, thought provoking as always, sir. Yellow thumb. Is this actual live or tape live? Do you do a real-time interaction with your viewers? Yes, in fact, les vire. I am live at 2 p. Pacific, as this is 2 p. Pacific, or we're in the 2 o'clock hour. And you may chat if you're on Facebook. Or I think if you're on emilguillermo.media in the chat, I will respond live. I will interact live, just like I have interacted live with you now. I think YouTube, there's a chat, but I don't see that till later. And Twitter, if you're on at Emil Amok on Twitter, yeah, sometimes I'll see it, not live. And just to show you I'm interacting live with people, here's our Taipei semi-correspondent. I say semi-correspondent because we don't really have correspondent. He's a listener. He says Congress is shameless and already doesn't feel guilt for erasing the Civil War and voting. Well, yeah. This is the thing. The erasure of the past, of the Civil War, of voting. Well, voting rights. It's funny. We should start seeing it as erasure, as opposed to merely a pendulum swing. We need to embrace that metaphor, because that's what the vote last night in the Senate, that's what it does. It essentially erases. It's not just a pendulum swing. And clarification from Nicholas. He's live on Facebook from Taipei. And yes, Nicholas, thank you very much for being a listener and interacting with us live on Facebook at emilguillermo.media or on my regular Facebook page, Emil Guillermo. emilguillermo.media is the favorite one. But I do want Nicholas to come on at some point to talk about what's happening in Taipei, what's happening in Taiwan, because it was front page news in the New York Times, and at some point we will bring him in to talk about that because it's significant. couple of other things before we call it a day. Yesterday, I talked about this fellow, a Sri Lankan, who's in the news for being on a tech podcast. I saw it on Twitter the other day. Uh, Chamath Palihapatia, or Chamath Palihapatia, Sri Lankan. And I said yesterday he was a trillionaire. Oh, forgive me. He's not a trillionaire. I gave him a raise. He is only a billionaire. So, not as haughty and as good as I had thought. Not a trillionaire. A billionaire. Well, but that's bad enough. If you'll recall, I said that he was on this podcast, a tech podcast, and he was saying how nobody cares about what's happening to the Uyghurs. It was brought up in this topic, in this tech podcast, where people were saying, hey, Biden's policies, good, but the policies hadn't helped him in the polls. And Palipataya said, quote, nobody cares about what's happening to the Uyghurs, okay? You bring it up because you really care, and I think it's nice that you care. The rest of us don't care. Now, if you're going to be that callous, you can only be that callous if people know that, oh, maybe you're joking a little bit. But he didn't really indicate that. In fact, his comments are pretty bold and brazen. He said, I care about the fact that our economy could turn on a dime if China invades Taiwan. I care about that. I care about climate change. And I care about America's crippling, decrepit healthcare infrastructure. But if you're asking me, do I care with a segment of a class of people in another country? Not until we can take care of ourselves will I prioritize them over us. This is a quote from Chamath Palihapitiya, or Palipatia. And then he goes on, and I think a lot of people believe that. A lot of people don't believe that. Chamath. Thank goodness, huh? He says, sorry if that's a hard truth to hear, but every time I say that I care about the Uyghurs, I am really just lying if I don't really care. Super honesty. Still, get you no brownie points from me. And so I'd rather not lie to you and tell you the truth. It's not a priority for me. And then he said, it's a sad state of affairs when human rights as a concept globally falls beneath tactical and strategic issues that we have to have. And then he said really what is a first world belief. Maybe even a Teddy Roosevelt belief. He said, he called it a luxury belief. The reason I think it's a luxury belief, said Palipatia, is we don't do enough domestically to actually express that view in real, tangible ways. So until we actually clean up our own house, the idea that we step outside of our borders with us sort of morally virtue signaling about somebody else's human rights track record is deplorable. Oh, spoken like a true billionaire. A true billionaire, a true first world billionaire who probably has more money than Roosevelt. Because, maybe for the times it's about equal. You kind of need $1 billion to have the same amount of money that Teddy Roosevelt did. But boy, this guy's political views, about the same. Because remember, Teddy Roosevelt was seen not as a bad guy totally. He was seen, he's a naturalist. The national parks. Oh, what a guy. What a great guy. But, when they took down that that statue at the Natural History Museum, well, there he is, Teddy Roosevelt on a horse. There's an Indian on one side, or a Native American on one side, and an African American slave on the other. So I think I bring this up again because Palipatia is an example of what happens when you achieve a certain amount of success. And he has, as the head of a venture capital firm, making his billions of dollars. You forget. And I think it's getting to him a little bit because he has come back on in his Twitter feed. He said, look, he's acknowledged that he was a Sri Lankan refugee who went to Canada and then went there as a child, now lives in California where the money is, where his companies are, Silicon Valley. He says, somewhat sheepishly, I recognize that I come across as lacking empathy. A little bit. Quote, as a refugee, my family fled a country with its own set of human rights issues, so this is something that is very much a part of my lived experience. Past tense. To be clear, my belief is that human rights matter whether in China, the United States, or elsewhere, full stop, he says. Well, or just when it serves him. So, anyway, it's worth pointing out because the reason why it got a lot of traction is because they identified him as an owner of the Golden State Warriors. And he's only a big investor. He's not a guy who has day-to-day operations and says, Steph Curry, stop shooting. Draymond Green, stop yelling at the referee. He doesn't have that kind of power. But on Twitter, it sort of went viral. And then I was reading it in the New York Times. I saw it on Twitter, but then I said, oh, it's made the Times. People need to know about this. Because, there are people in our community who are very wealthy, extremely wealthy. And you have to wonder if their heart's in the right place. Or if they have been cured of their past and are solely in the present, understanding that their success has delivered them from their past. It's sad, though, I think, because it's almost like, well, I mean, now he's coming back and trying to say, hey, look, I do remember I was a refugee. But here's the thing about people with money. You can stand on your money all you want. It doesn't make you a big guy. Not when the world is filled with white supremacists. So I think that's it for today's show. I think, I did correct myself. I made him, I promoted him and called him a trillionaire, and I had to demote him back to reality that he is just a billionaire. So tomorrow's show, it's Friday. To continue on into a semi-sports thing, because sports it's part of society. It matters. We care about it. The 49ers, San Francisco Bay Area, Asian American sports fans. 49ers playing Saturday against Aaron Rodgers. Oh, that's going to be a good game against the Packers. I don't know what's going to happen, but it's important. Sports is important. It brings us together. And that's why also tomorrow on Friday, I'm going to talk about Tim Lincecum because the Hall of Fame ballots are out. Voting is going to be tabulated. It will be announced next week if Tim Lincecum made it into the Hall of Fame, baseball's Hall of Fame. Tomorrow, I will talk about why Tim Lincecum, San Francisco Giants Major League pitcher, and the best Filipino-American baseball player ever, should be elected to the Hall of Fame. That's tomorrow. On tomorrow's show. Hey, look, thank you very much for joining us. If you enjoyed the show, tweet it out. Share a link. Pass a link to friends. Let them know that you like Emil Muck's Takeout Live. Emil Muck's Takeout Live, which is a different show from Emil Muck's Takeout, which is the podcast. If you go to my amok.com site, you'll see a link there to take you to the podcast. You can also get the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. But the podcast is a different show from our live show, this live stream, where, as I've mentioned to viewers on this show, you can interact live on the platform on Facebook. Just go to Emil Guillermo.media, or I think you can interact on Facebook Live or Facebook Watch. One of those two things. Anyway, so I thank you for listening to this program, Emil Muck's Takeout number 227. We talked about Biden's news, Michelle Go, teased Tim Lincecum. Read my columns at the ALDEF blog, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. And you'll see that picture of Michelle Go. It's a big picture of her. It's an artist rendering, an animated portrait that shows her, 40-year-old woman from California, who had lots of friends on social media. There are lots of people who just say so many nice things about the kind of person she was. And it's just sad. It's just sad that she's gone. What happened? Pushed from behind. Never saw it coming. Pushed onto the tracks. And it's going to take a lot to solve that problem. We've been trying to solve it a long time, or New York has. And I think, as I said in my column today, her memory is best served if we use it as a metaphor for how we are as a society today. We've been pushed. We've fallen. And we need each other to help us get back up. All right, if you're a regular listener to the show, you know that this is the time where I say, hey, look, you belong. You're worth it. Hey, don't give up. Give yourself a hug. Any kind of feeling of shame or doubts about your self-worth, remember, just walk through that door and into the room of love, self-love. Self-love will get you through. And so, as I wish for me, I wish for you. May you be safe. May you be happy. May you be healthy. And may you live with ease. Emil Guillermo here. Back tomorrow. Till then, mahal kita.